Welcome to our next webinar on the coronavirus vaccination and the considerations for employers. My name is Samantha Randall and I'm Associate Solicitor here at Palmer's. So what I'm basically going to be taking you through in this video is some of the considerations that employers need to look out for over the next couple of months or even years as the rollout of the vaccine and return to work takes place. So, the coronavirus pandemic has undoubtedly impacted how businesses conduct their operations, and many employees are actually working from home to try and reduce the risk of spreading the virus at the moment. As the UK continues to roll out its vaccination programme, businesses therefore need to consider the implications of forcing employees to get inoculated. Now, the government has not released any guidance on the vaccination for employers at the moment, but existing law does give us some pointers as to how to approach these issues. So, one of the first questions is, are there any circumstances in which employers can require an employee to have a vaccination? Now, vaccinations are highly effective in protecting people, which could easily tempt employers to require workers to get vaccinated. However, the government has not legislated for the vaccine to be mandatory, so on a balance, it would be quite risky for employers to be able to insist on vaccination, even in workplaces where there is close contact to vulnerable people, such as in the social care sector. ACAS guidance, however, does advise that employees should support their staff in getting the vaccine and detail the benefits of the vaccine to their employees, but ultimately they cannot force it upon them. Now, that's not to say there might be circumstances in the future where it is necessary to make the vaccination mandatory for someone to carry out their role. For example, if their role requires travel overseas, there may be a requirement to be vaccinated. Another consideration is whether and why employees might actually object to receiving the vaccination and what issues this is likely to present for employers. Now, a recent survey from YouGov has suggested that actually 1 in 5 people are unlikely to get the vaccination. And the reasons for this vary from either a lack of confidence in the safety of the vaccination to being opposed to vaccinations in general. Now, any available vaccine may, of course, not be suitable for everyone, and therefore there is a number of factors for employees to consider before rolling out any vaccination policy of their own. Now, these vary over a range of different matters, the first being age. Obviously, as the vaccination programme rollout is currently being based largely on the age of the individual. Older workers are therefore more likely to be offered the vaccination, with younger workers less likely to be offered the vaccination until a much later date. Another consideration is, of course, disability. So there are some individuals who have been advised not to have the vaccine due to a medical condition. And such employees may well be disabled for the purposes of the Equality Act 2010. And their choice not to get vaccinated could be something that is arising from a disability. And this could mean that if they are treated unfavourably as a result, unless this was justified, of course. Another consideration is those who are pregnant, and currently, the vaccine is not recommended to those who are pregnant, breastfeeding, or planning to get pregnant. And another consideration, or a quite topical issue, would be in relation to religion and belief. There are, of course, certain religious and moral obligations and objections to vaccines, which could be protected as a protected characteristic under the Equality Act. For example, gelatine is derived from pigs and is often used in the mass production of vaccines, which could, of course, cause several issues for particular religious groups, and those who are vegan or vegetarian employees. Now, ethical veganism has been found in an employment tribunal to be a belief that is capable of being protected under the Equality Act, and it's therefore important to remember that those who follow a particular religion may still choose to get the vaccination, even if they have particular religious arguments against it. And that is the same choice that ethical vegans may make. Even if the vaccine does contain animal products or has been tested on animals, they may well still decide to get it if overall they can see the benefit. So it doesn't mean that these individuals no longer have protection, or that they no longer have this protected belief, or that other people who choose to refuse the vaccine cannot be protected. So vaccination policies may therefore be indirectly discriminatory against these particular employees, unless they can, of course, be justified. Now, there are various exceptions that may need to be carved out in respect of these categories of employees if an employer was looking to roll out this type of policy. There is then the question of what happens to those who are not vaccinated and how will they be treated in the workplace. For example, whether it is appropriate to continue with protective measures, to consider redeployment, or the potential discrimination as to whether whether or not that is appropriate. Another consideration is, what about anti-vaxxers? Now, it may be that someone's anti-vaccination position could amount to a protected philosophical belief under the Equality Act 2010. And the Employment Appeal Tribunal gave some guidance on the definition of what they believe to be a philosophical belief within the case of Granger plc and others versus Nicholson, which set out the definition essentially. Now, the first element is that it must be a genuinely held belief. And the belief, it must be a belief. It's not an opinion or a viewpoint based on the present state of information that's available. It must be a belief as to a weighty and substantial aspect of human life and behaviour. And it must attain a certain level of cognizance and seriousness, cohesion and importance. It must be worthy of respect in a democratic society and not be incompatible with human dignity and not to conflict with other fundamental rights of others. It must have a similar status or cognizance to a religious belief. However, it needs not to allude to a fully fledged system of thoughts. In other words, it does not need to be an ism. It need not be shared by others. While support of a political party does not itself amount to a sociological belief, it is a political philosophy and doctrine, such as socialism or Marxism, or the free market capitalism might qualify. A physiological belief may be based on science, such as Darwinism, and essentially it must be plainly capable of being a philosophical belief. There are certainly scope for a wide range of views on the vaccination which could fall within this definition, but obviously not all views will qualify, and a complex analysis is therefore required into the individual's particular beliefs and their basis for it. And for such claims to be successful, there will of course need to be a detriment and a causative connection to the religion or belief. So in that regard, each case and individual belief is going to be very much based on its merits and to that particular individual. Now, in terms of in the workplace, another consideration may be that if an employer has rolled out a policy, can an employee actually be dismissed for refusing the vaccination? Now, a failure to follow a reasonable management instruction can lead to a further dismissal, and this would most likely be a dismissal on the grounds of some other substantial reason. Whilst there is yet to be any case law authority on this point, a tribunal is likely to have sympathy with an employee who just didn't want to get the vaccine, or is then dismissed or disciplined as a result of that. A tribunal would be reluctant to find it fair to impose what is effectively a medical procedure on an employee, notwithstanding their basic human rights. However, the nature of the workplace may well be a relevant factor when deciding this. And in view of the risks of a mandatory vaccination programme, it is advisable for employers to consider how best to achieve a voluntary vaccination. An employer has an implied duty to take reasonable care as to the health and safety of its employees, and to take reasonable steps to ensure and provide a safe workplace under the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. This includes carrying out risk assessments, implementing measures which minimise the risks that are identified, and clearly encouraging and enabling vaccination is a key step to mitigating the risk of COVID-19 transmission in the workplace. Now, looking on to the actual practicalities of employees being out of work temporarily to go and actually get their vaccinations, that leads to the question of whether employees are entitled to time off during working hours to go and get their vaccinations. Now, although there is no general right in law for an employee to have the right to time off for medical appointments, most employers are likely to want to support the national push for vaccination and allow employees to attend their appointments. Employers should also check their contracts and policies to see what rights employees have around attending medical appointments. And employees who are clinically extremely vulnerable may well be classed as disabled under the Equality Act, and therefore this could trigger an obligation on the employer to make reasonable adjustments to accommodate their needs, which may well be allowing time off to receive a vaccination, which could amount to a reasonable adjustment. Now, vaccinating, shielding employees whose jobs cannot be done from home is also an important step to getting back to work. However, the vaccination doesn't guarantee protection against COVID-19. Just because a clinically vulnerable member of staff has had their jab, employees shouldn't demand their immediate return to work without a thorough risk assessment being taken place first. What's more is that employers could find themselves in breach of the mutual trust and confidence that is implied into employment contracts if they stand in the way of an employee being vaccinated. An employee may well argue that given the seriousness of the pandemic, that their employer preventing them from getting a vaccine would be sufficiently serious to constitute a breach of their contract, and essentially a breach of trust and confidence. So, can an employer ask an employee to change their appointment to a more convenient time? So, where possible, we would recommend employers allow their employees to attend vaccinations at the time slot they have been allocated, especially where employees are working from home. Attending a local appointment is therefore unlikely to cause any substantial interruption to a business. However, if an employer has a valid reason not to allow the employee to attend their designated slot, for example, that they work shift work and this cannot be covered by anyone else, or they work away on a site away from home, then it may well be possible to ask that employee to reschedule their appointment. If employees are offered a choice of appointment times, it would be fair for an employer to ask that they choose a time that minimises disruption to the business. However, if the vaccination appointment does take place during working hours, then there is no legal requirement for an employee to be paid for their time off. Nevertheless, an employer may choose to do so in order to incentivise the employee to get the vaccination and thus protect the health and safety of others at the same time. So, can an employer require an employee to then disclose whether they have been vaccinated or not? So, requiring an employee to disclose whether they've had the vaccine or not does give rise to certain data protection issues and potentially discriminatory issues as well. So employers will have to consider why they need evidence of vaccination and whether it is appropriate for the business. So this will therefore require an assessment as to various issues, such as their reason for actually requiring this information, how it will be held, and who will have access to this, and whether it's appropriate to actually hold any more information than a simple yes or no. A reasonable employer will therefore want to understand why an employee has made a particular decision not to have a vaccine. But requiring this detail would therefore then pose a risk of discrimination based on the earlier reasons that we've set out. There is also the possibility of a more national requirement for individuals to hold perhaps a vaccination passport that would record whether or not that they've had the vaccine, which in itself can lead to potential data protection, privacy and discrimination issues, as we've already touched on, even if this is to be considered as part of a national measure, which we don't know currently. So in terms of once an employee has had the vaccine, is an employee then entitled to statutory sick pay under their SSP suspension of waiting days regulations if they are then off sick with side effects of having received the vaccine? So the regulations state that there are no waiting days for the employee off work because they are incapable by reason of infection or contamination with the coronavirus from working, or because they are required to self-isolate because of COVID. So the science behind the vaccine is well beyond the remit of this video. However, it's safe to say that the vaccine does not appear to be live vaccines. And this means that a vaccinated person would not be infected or contaminated with the actual virus. On this basis, potentially the normal SSP rules would apply, and an employee would have to serve 3 waiting days before SSP is payable if they were off sick having received side effects from the vaccination. However, obviously, if it was a live vaccination, then that could well be a different issue. Which leads us on to whether employers should actually pay for the vaccine. So, I mean, currently there is no option for the vaccine to be commercially available. However, if it is something that we have to essentially live by as part of our daily life, such as the flu jab, then obviously there is a cost to employees in this regard, depending on your age and your circumstances. However, if an employee does require an employee to be vaccinated as a health and safety measure, then it would require the cost of that vaccination to be paid for. Many employers will be happy to pay for the COVID vaccination in a similar way to the large numbers of them that do for the flu vaccination. This would not be a taxable benefit if it does not exceed the cost of £50. It is possible that if the cost exceeds this, then the government will provide an exemption for this. However, obviously this remains to be seen in the future as we begin to live with COVID effectively. Now, turning to the next consideration, how will a vaccine actually impact an employer's COVID-19 risk assessment? So obviously risk assessments would have been carried out as part of ensuring a COVID secure workplace. However, these will obviously now need to be updated to reflect vaccinations. So employers will effectively need to update their risk assessments to reflect the availability of the vaccine when it is rolled out or more widely to the rest of the population. In view of the potential for individuals to refuse the vaccine, the risk assessment may well need to determine if additional measures can be put in place for an employee who chooses not to be vaccinated. Now, this is going to be of a greater importance in certain settings, such as health and social care, where COVID-19 is a reportable disease under the Reporting of Injury, Diseases and Dangerous Occurrences Regulations, or RIDDRA as it is commonly known as. And choosing not to have the vaccine would therefore put patients at risk. So it may well be treated differently in the future when it comes to those particular settings. So what does all of this mean for employees, essentially? So employers will obviously need to consider the vaccination as part of their risk assessments going forward, and should ultimately be encouraging their employees to get vaccinated, because once this becomes a realistic possibility for everyone. So we're still some months away from this point yet. If an employer does intend to mandate a vaccine as part of its approach to reducing risk, of course, it will be open to discrimination claims, and it will therefore need to consider whether there are reasonable alternatives to this, which should be explored as part of carrying out your risk assessments. Now, of course, employers should be careful not to judge and stereotype employees just because an employee is part of a religious group or an ethical vegan doesn't automatically mean that they'll refuse the vaccine, so it shouldn't be assumed, as we touched on earlier. Equally, an employer should not assume that the reason for someone's refusal is what the employer perceives to be their religion or disability. It could be for a completely different reason, so it's important not to make any assumptions, which potentially would be another form of perceptive discrimination. Now, vaccination policies itself could potentially be objectively justified as a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim to ultimately reduce risk and promote the health and safety in the workplace, and employees who are likely to have legitimate aims relating to health and safety and maximising the numbers of employees who can attend work safely. Vaccination policies may therefore be a proportionate way of achieving these aims, although this will depend upon the way that they are operated and the impact on the particular individuals. A policy, for instance, which allows employees to return to offices only when they have had a vaccination and leaves others working at home could well be justifiable. The legitimacy of the employee's aims and whether its policy is proportionate are questions to which the answer may vary over time, depending on what happens with the pandemic. For example, once herd immunity has been established, it will be harder to justify not making an exception for vaccine objectors. At present, we're of course still some time away from a vaccine being available to any employee. These questions will therefore need to be considered in light of the circumstances existing at that particular time, so employees shouldn't be looking to finalise any policies just yet. And that brings us to the end of our video on vaccinations. No doubt this may be an area for change in the future, so it's just a case of keeping posted with the guidance as normal, and thank you for watching.